With Juventus finally ending what was actually a fairly underwhelming unbeaten streak with 13 draws, is the pressure starting to grow on Thiago Motta?
Yes, and I think James has underlined the crux of it quite well, that if you look at the fact that Juventus got to nearly the end of January unbeaten in Serie A, that feels kind of Conte-esque, doesn't it? Because if you think of the first season of Antonio Conte at Juventus, he brought in a different philosophy, new broom, turned things around, and there are a lot of draws in that unbeaten season. But there weren't so many draws by this point, of course, because the fact is they lost that first game of the Serie A season, their first game of the Serie A season, to Napoli last week, and that cut them 15 points drift of Napoli at the top. And, you know, that shouldn't be possible for Juventus. You know, they're trying to make the team younger, they're trying to reconstruct, but still, that's not ideal. Now, I think there needs to be an understanding that Thiago Motta is rebuilding. The team's very young this season, especially now Danilo's gone. He's gone back to Flamengo this week. He's gone back to Brazil to sign for Flamengo, where he joins his old mate Alexandro. So there is a lack of experience in that team. And I think that's shown sometimes in their inability to close out some home games. And again, after the Napoli defeat, which I think could be expected in the context of the Serie A season, that they went and lost a game that globally didn't probably matter that much, but in the current state of where they are, losing 2-0 at home to Benfica is a terrible look. And Thiago Motta is an interesting coach. I think people looking at the numbers and saying, oh, well, it's really boring football, that's just, like, watch the games. Like, honestly, they've been a really interesting side to watch this season. But the defensive solidity that they had at the very start of the season has started to peel away a little bit. They've conceded some goals to teams they shouldn't have at home, and I'm looking at Parma, Benfica. So I think realistically, you've got to say there's an unevenness you would expect in a side that's being constructed. The question is, because Juventus is such a huge club, can you resist the external pressure and be allowed to get on with that? Because if we look at the pure numbers, this is Juventus's third worst start in Serie A of all time after 22 games, despite the fact they only lost that first game last weekend.
Yeah, Andy, you say they've been interesting to watch at times. Maybe I've just watched the wrong Juventus games. I mean, it might be that I've kind of been unlucky with that, because I've seen a fair few drab ones. I think there would be a certain amount of understanding for the fact that they're fifth, bearing in mind that they're cutting back financially, bearing in mind that they're leaning more on youth. But I think Thiago Motta's remit, more than anything, was to make them exciting and interesting again. And I don't feel he's really done that. I think looking at something like the XG, Inter, Atalanta, Milan, Lazio, Roma, and Napoli have all created more going forward than Juventus this season. And yeah, I don't doubt you that they have been doing interesting things now and again, but there's been a fair few games where they haven't. And I feel like after Allegri, the whole thing was make Juventus fun again, and that feels like it hasn't really happened so far. Would be my take, even if it's slightly contrary to yours.
Well, not unconnected. Jack on email also asked about Juve. Not unconnected to what Lars was saying there about youth, Andy. He's talking about the Juve's much-touted next-gen project. And he asks, does Kenan Yıldız, a brilliant Turkish player, by the way...
One of your favourites?
Yeah, he is actually. Oh, in the Euros, he lit it up for me.
Yeah,
actually.
yeah.
Well, one of the great players that lit it up from Turkey. Does Kenan Yıldız have to leave Juventus to reach his full potential? And also, what does that say about Juve's next-gen project and the state of the club right now?
Well, I think you have to be realistic. And the fact is that the problem with Kenan Yıldız is, well, it's not his problem, it's Juventus's problem. When Lars was talking about the creation of chances, so much of the offensive load has rested on him, and he's still a teenager. So I think if you look particularly at the first half of the season, he's being called on to create so much, he's not actually scoring that many goals. I mean, you can't look at a teenager and say, you be our Ibrahimovic for Inter in 2009, 2010 and just, or 2008, 2009, just create everything. We won't even worry about the quality of football because you are going to make some magic happen. That is an unbearable pressure to put on someone of that age. Now, he's gone on to score some goals in very important games and score goals at a decent volume. But I think when we're talking about Thiago Motta, to briefly go back to what we were talking about, when you're talking about Thiago Motta changing the way that Juventus play, I think it's subtler than people realise. I think people who didn't watch Bologna that closely said, it's going to be innovative football and it's going to be exciting football. It can be innovative football without being exciting football. I think that's the thing. His teams have always defended properly and they do some interesting stuff, but it's not all out attacking. And anyone expecting that really hadn't done their homework. There was no way they were going to play really open football. Now, on the other hand, when you've got someone like Kenan Yıldız in the team, you're thinking he's got such huge potential that is a team that's not all out attacking, holding him back. And maybe that cuts back into Jack's question as well. I would say that he is in a good place at the moment because he is a key player for that team and he wouldn't be, I don't think, quite yet a key player in a lot of other European teams of similar sizes. So for him to be there, like whether Motta stays or not, and I think he will stay, I think he will get a chance. I think what Juventus have been very bad at, again, to go into Jack's point, is developing young players going forward. Not just ones that have come out of their academy and now the next gen program, but I think you look at Kulusevski and Bentancur, who look like really squad ballast, just treading water. And then, especially when they first arrive at Tottenham, they look like, they're off the leash now and they're getting a chance. And you realise at that point how poor Juventus have become at developing players. So really, Kenan Yıldız is an ideal test case for this. Can they move on? And this, to me, would be one of the major stand or fall moments of the Motta regime. Can he make Kenan Yıldız as good as he should be? And if he can do that, that's a huge step to him keeping his job and making Juventus successful.
Great question and really good answer, I must say, actually. And it's given us a really wide landscape of Juve, where they are now and so on. This question, though, from Tim on Blue Sky, with Niko Kovač being confirmed for the Dortmund job, is he the right man to turn their fortunes around, Lars?
I mean, I'm a little bit puzzled by this. But I guess you're a little bit restricted by what's available when you have to make a change mid-season. He's got an 18-month contract, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. Dortmund looks to me for all the world like a club that's in need of a reset, a club that needs to find some kind of identity again. The fans are understandably pining for the heavy metal days of Jurgen Klopp. It's a club that I feel like when it's at its best, it's really feeding off the energy that they get from their incredible fans and a wonderful stadium. And I mean, I feel like the closest, I mean, it basically feels like they've lost their way a little bit with a succession of managers who haven't really been able to find any sort of identity. And Niko Kovač occurs to me to be more of a pragmatist, someone who did really well at Frankfurt in particular, got the Bayern job off the back of that. But maybe some shortcomings were revealed at Bayern. I remember distinctly that the attacking players at Bayern were unhappy with the lack of specific tactical instructions. He's someone who's more concerned with maybe setting the team up without the ball and creating a solid unit there. And he's gone on to work at Monaco, work at Wolfsburg. I don't see him as a guy who can come in and like kickstart a new project, to use a slightly annoying word, but like it's much more a case of getting a safe pair of hands in to try to salvage something from the season. Interesting that they supposedly spoke to Ralf Rangnick, though conflicting reports about what exactly they spoke to him about, what kind of role. But he would seem like much more someone like a team that's lost its way, that's in need of a fresh start, a new identity. You push the Rangnick button, you know, that seems to make more sense, but that didn't come off, and instead you've got an 18-month contract to Niko Kovač. Safe pair of hands, I guess, but not for me the fresh start that Dortmund probably need.
I guess that's the thing, Lars, isn't it? So much of this is dictated by their financial situation, like the imperative to get back in the Champions League. So we kind of talked about that sort of forcing Textor's hand, or at least Textor feeling it forced his hand at Lyon on the main show yesterday. Now, obviously, this does play into the considerations. I mean, they wanted to give Nuri Sahin, as we spoke about on last week's show and a bit the week before, time to really work on a project. But when we talk about a project and a philosophy of football, you can't really do the lab thing when you've got bills to pay, can you? It's like, taking a year off, like quitting your job to write a novel or something, isn't it? It's something that's very difficult to financially justify. So I think if you look at the situation that they're in, I agree with you. There are so many reasons why Niko Kovač is a bad idea for the job. It's got a feeling of next cab off the rank. It's got a feeling as well of they don't really know what they're doing philosophy-wise, because they bring in Sahin to create an attacking, exciting philosophy of football, and then they get in a guy who's all very belt and braces. My question to you in return would be, having said that, you look at Dortmund that have a lot of offensive solutions that will take care of themselves. Players who can create stuff like Gittins, like Maxi Bayer. Girassi will score however crap the team is. That's not an issue. Is a bit of defence and midfield organisation not what they need? So might they be getting what they need kind of by accident?
Now, there is a certain short-term logic to that, and you can't. The having a big project is difficult when you have to pay the bills. I think having a big project and then putting a very inexperienced manager in charge of it, I think is like you're banking a lot on Nuri Sahin being the guy, which maybe he will turn out to be later in his career, but it's a big ask. It would be different if you get in someone like Rangnick, who has done it in various capacities at more than one club and really built something. I'd feel better about that as a cultural reset, as a finding a new identity and all of that. I think with Kovač, again, they are not, even if they're all the way down in 11th, they are actually just 6 points off of 4th, that crucial Champions League spot. And they do have good players. So is it completely unfeasible that with the squad they have, they can get 6 points more than the guys who are above them between now and the end of the season? I don't think that's impossible. So there is a sort of getting a more pragmatic coach who's worked in different contexts, even in different countries, who has seen in a few different... I don't think experience is a bad thing. There's always an idea of looking at the next exciting new thing in football. But in the situation they have, they are kind of desperate to salvage something and try for that last Champions League spot. I'm not sure Kovač is a bad man for that. Like you say, just settle it, make that defense work better, and leave the likes of Gittins and Girassi and the guys going forward to create stuff. In the short term, that can work, but the broader situation, at the risk of repeating myself, is that Dortmund are a club that seem to have lost their way. And in terms of a big reset and creating something new and finding out who they are, I'm not sure Kovač does that for you.
This question from Adam on Instagram might get you out of the problem of repeating yourself, because he's asking about the Saudi Pro League, something completely different.
Oh, yeah. I'll say some things about that I've never said before, I'm sure.
As long as you don't repeat yourself. Anyway, the question is, with John Duran and Barcelona's young gem Unai Hernandez both set to depart for the Saudi Pro League, are the Saudis changing their approach now to target younger players rather than more established star names? Do you want to go with that first, Andy?
Clearly, to an extent, that's true. And I think the Unai Hernandez deal is maybe even a little bit more interesting than the John Duran deal in terms of that, because John Duran, even if you are paying for potential rather than definite quality, and that seems to be a very, very key aim in the transfer market at the moment. You look at the clubs who are interested in him, and this is a Saudi Pro League club, Al Nassr, getting John Duran ahead of other interested parties like some big clubs in the Premier League, potentially Real Madrid, PSG, etc., etc. Unai Hernandez is a bit different because he's come through La Masia. He's been in the Barcelona B team. He's thought of as someone who could do well in the future. He was captain of the B team. And really, I think that there's two sides to this. There's the Barcelona side and there's the Saudi side. Now, from the Barcelona side, is this a worrying trend of where things are going next. Because, of course, what they've always wanted to do to fix their financial problems is sell the players they never should have bought in the first place, like Frankie de Jong, up until this season, Rafinha. They want to sell Andres Christensen. They want to sell experienced players on big wages, whose wages that they don't really want to pay anymore, and do what they should have done in the first place and live off the brilliant youth products that they have. If they get to the point where they have to sell the youth products, that is another level of burning the future. And I think there are a lot of people in La Liga circles, not just Barcelona circles, who are extremely concerned with the sale of Unai Hernandez for this reason. I think logically, if you look at football in the region, like Qatari club football has stopped buying big names or expensive stars and sort of moved over to a more youth-based solution. If you look at, say, the partnership that QSI at PSG have created with Braga, for example, they've invested so much in academies in Qatar in recent years, and this was happening before the World Cup, so they've been working on this for a while. So for Saudi football to pivot and do that makes a lot of sense, especially as Saudi has a very strong footballing culture, if you remove the money context from it. But the John Duran one is interesting. I mean, Luke very passionately spoke on yesterday's Ramble about this and how he thinks that John Duran is making a big mistake and it's quite unambitious for his career. I personally understand why he would do it. But what do you think this says, Lars, about the aims of the Saudi Pro League?
I don't care, really. I mean, there's nothing that's happened to do with the Saudi Pro League has given me any reason to think this will ever be a serious entity in world football. They can throw as much money at it as they want. It's not an interesting league for anyone outside of Saudi. And then there is a genuine football culture in Saudi, don't get me wrong, but it's not like you can throw ludicrous money at the odd player here and there, but it doesn't make the league interesting. And so far the few games I've watched have been terrible, and it's not something that's interesting to me whatsoever, so I don't really care. I when it comes to the players, I increasingly, perhaps I'm getting older, I increasingly don't like turning down money on other people's behalf. Like it's really easy for me to be sat in my flat saying, "Oh, I'd never do this just for the money." But it's difficult it's different when you have the contract in front of you, and in one you can put down your signature a couple of places, and no one in your family will ever have to work again. I think that is a slightly different situation, and you could argue that would be the case if you went to a different club in Europe as well. I get that, but again, with someone I was very lucky. I grew up in Norway. It's very comfortable. John Duran did very much not grow up in Norway. Like he grew up in a rough part of the world, and for him to have a chance to make that kind of decision and secure the future for several generations of his family, I think I find it very hard to judge him. But it is hard. It is sad because it means you've essentially, from my perspective, finished as an elite level footballer, or at the club level at least. You've more or less retired from serious club football. But it's a financial decision that I can kind of understand why some people make.
Is there a better argument for doing that at Duran's age, though? You earn some money, you come back, and you're still like a player with your whole career ahead of you. Yeah,
and the thing about Duran is that I don't think we know as much about John Duran as a footballer as people seem to think we know. He hasn't played a lot. Like he's played like last season he played 463 minutes in the Premier League.
Super sub.
This season he's played 627 minutes in the Premier League. These are tiny sample sizes.
He scores some great goals.
Yes, he has, and he might continue to.
He's proved himself so far a scorer of great goals rather than a great goal scorer, which is the difference.
You're absolutely right. It's not consistent.
He's overperformed his XG by a phenomenal amount. So one of two things is true. Either John Duran is the best finisher in the history of football. That could be true. Could also be true he's been on a bit of a hot streak and scored some improbable goals that are probably not repeatable. If I was Aston Villa and I was offered the kind of money for him based on what he's done so far, I would take the money and very literally run out of the negotiation room. I'm not saying it's impossible that he matures into one of the best strikers in the world. I'm just saying that is a bet that you're taking with, it's a bit of a long shot based on what we've seen so far. Yeah. And I can understand all parties involved if this transaction happens.
Would you be able to run with that much money in tow?
That's true. I mean, maybe it's like, maybe get paid in Bitcoin, so it's just on a disc.
I would take the money and slowly drag it away.
Mate, it's the modern times. You don't have to have it in cash. Okay? Exactly. Anything you like.
All in 2p's, taking it off to Sainsbury's to put in the machine.
This is a serious question. I think this is a question that a lot of listeners to Ask OTC will be interested in hearing about. From Lee on Blue Sky, what can we expect from Kyle Walker's move to AC Milan? Will Serie A be a better fit for, and this is a crucial part perhaps, an ageing full-back?
Well, did anyone else watch Manchester City's first half struggles against Club Brugge on Wednesday and think, actually, can Kyle Walker be any worse than what they've currently got? I mean, clearly there's been some sort of collective decision to move on there, but he still seems very, very hungry. I think we've seen, say, Ashley Young, if we're going to compare a player, not quite the same player, but a similar sort of position, certainly in the latter part of his career, really succeed there. Of course, he went on and won a Scudetto with Inter. I don't see any reason why Kyle Walker wouldn't be a big success at Milan. And you look at the players who've left the Premier League and gone on to succeed, whether they be English players or just players who were in the Premier League. So, you know, you can look at Lukaku, McTominay, we talked about Ashley Young, Smalling, so many of them. I think there's every chance that he goes on and does really, really well there. Having said that, Lars, after that first game where he was in the stand watching Milan beat Parma last weekend, and he sees them turn around a 2-1 deficit to a 3-2 win in stoppage time, and then sees his soon-to-be coach try and grab the current right back by the neck and have to be like pulled off him by a series of players, you are thinking, oh, I'm really glad I did all those weights in my 20s.
No, I think that would be a great sign, surely, because if you think about competition for places, one guy is a guy who the coach is actively trying to punch on the field, and the other guy is Emerson Royal, so you probably feel pretty good about your chances of getting into the team, with the situation being what it is. I do want to point out, like I said, I don't want to judge players who choose to take the money and go to Saudi Arabia too harshly because we don't know their circumstances. But I think we should note when players decide to not do that. I'm sure Kyle Walker could have made more money by heading that way, but instead he clearly wants another challenge at this stage of his career, tries to test himself in a new league, a new country. I think that's laudable and kind of cool, and I'm looking forward to seeing how that goes.
Yeah. What Lee should have asked, really, Lee on Blue Sky should have asked, can anyone in Italy beat Kyle Walker?
Yes, exactly.
You know what I mean? This from Benjamin on Instagram. Is Real Betis the club which is going to get Antony back to his best?
I guess the big question has to be, what is his best? Because not only did Manchester United overpay for him when they bought him from Ajax, vastly overpay for him. We're all aware of that, and we don't really need to go back over that again. But was he ever a player who suggested he was going to be part of Europe's elite? I personally have my doubts over that. I think he was a player who, in a different financial context, if they'd have paid a more realistic price for him, he's a player who I could have seen doing a really good job in the Premier League. One thing I always really loved about Antony, and you know, the numbers were very much a work in progress, but given his size, he was always very difficult to wrestle off the ball, and he's difficult to kick out of the game. Now, I think that gives him a bit of a start. Now, of course, if we're looking at like under 6 foot left foot creators, you know, they've moved on from some of those over the last while, Betis, and you think Nabil Fekir went off like a little while back. So there's definitely a gap for Betis to have that sort of player. But I would like to see Antony recover that sort of attitude that he had at Ajax, that, right, you're never going to kick me out of this game, and try and develop from there. But in terms of the price that United paid for him, was, you can say that it doesn't really matter because they have the money, all that sort of stuff. Although I don't think that's true anymore. You can see by the sort of cuts they've been making. But I think you can underestimate how much pressure that puts on certain players. He never looked even close to coping with that, did he?
But this move to Betis has provided us with my favourite bit of Antony-related media ever, which is the announcement video from the club of him being signed, which you haven't seen. It is an absolute masterpiece of the sort of... It is... I would have loved to be in the pitch meeting for this. I don't understand why this has been created and why, but they basically made a David Lynch tribute video to announce the arrival of Antony.
Twin Peaks.
And there's no other way of describing it. It is a straight up David Lynch tribute video with some David Lynch shot interspersed with some Betis things, and then it's Antony at the culmination of it. And it is very odd, but maybe it's fitting because I feel like he's always he's a bit of a surrealist winger. Like often when I watched him play for United, I was left confused about what is it that I'm watching here. I can't quite make why is this happening in front of my eyes is something I often felt watching him. So maybe that was the idea behind it. I don't know. Hopefully he can find his way again. And I concur. It is something players don't pick their transfer fees, and it's something that I think about quite a lot. Like it's not his fault that United spent 3 or 4 times more on him that they should have. And that he suddenly has expectations to be the finished. I mean, if you pay that much, you're expecting the guy to be the finished product, and it's not his fault that he's not. Like that's not on him. It's like it's such a common trope of like attacking a player for not being worth what a club decided they thought he was worth. It's not the player's fault. Yeah. It's slightly different if the player is demanding like a huge wage. If you look at something like Marcus Rashford at Man United now, who negotiated hard to get himself a huge contract and has delivered absolutely nothing since. There, I think making the money part of your line of criticism is valid. But Antony didn't decide for United to pay that much for him. So that is actually, you could say a lot of things about Antony, and there have been some fairly unsavory stories about him. But on that side of it, I have some sympathy.
And it goes back to Juventus at the very beginning. United in recent years have been very, very ineffective developers of players, and he's one of the people who suffered from that, I guess.
Yeah, it's interesting that the question asked, will Real Betis get Antony back to his best rather than back to being the best? Do you know what I mean?
There's a definition there, isn't there? Yeah.
On that note, thank you for listening to Ask OTC. If you'd like to ask a question, you can contact us at any time at Radio Dotun, at Andy Brassel, at Lars Sivertsen, or at OTC Pod. And you can email us, otc@footballramble.com.